Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute webinars, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, and communities. For today's webinar, Dr. Brad Kurz will speak about COVID-19 in higher education, governmental and institutional policy responses. Before I invite him to begin, I want to share a few housekeeping notes. First, we'll close the webinar today with a question and answer session. Those of you who connected to today's webinar via your computer can submit your questions in the chat screen. So to open the chat, just click the chat button that you see at the menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you joined by phone, then you can email me your questions at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical problems during today's webinar, then please let me know by either submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you could also send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu. Fourth, we will make a webinar recording available to you. You can look for an email from Zoom that shares more about where you can access that recorded copy in about a day from now. Additionally, all of our previous Engaging for Missouri webinars are available on our division's YouTube page. So now we'll transition to the topic of today's webinar, which is titled COVID-19 in Higher Education, Governmental and Institutional Policy Responses. Presenting on this topic is Dr. Brad Kurz, who is the John C. Weaver Faculty Fellow in Higher Education Administration and an Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis at the University of Missouri. So thank you, Brad, for presenting today. If you could please start your video and unmute your microphone, then we can begin today's presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, Alice. And thank you everybody for joining me today as I talk a little bit about how our sort of federal government, state governments, and institutions have been responding to this pandemic crisis. So just to sort of jump right in, I'm going to sort of talk about the federal policy responses. They sort of moved a little bit quicker than the states. The main policy response has been the CARES Act, or the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act. Within that act, there is a specific fund for education stabilization, which was roughly about $30 to $31 billion. Broadly, it was broken down across three areas. The first was an allocation to the governors to be used within their states, about 10% of that $30 billion allocation. It was allocated to the states based on a formula, 60% based on the population aged 5 to 24, and then 40% based on the population of children in roughly public schools, but those that are sort of counted and under the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act. And so the formula was driven to sort of target the school-age population for the most part. Governors have broad discretion then to use those funds to bolster the education within their states. They're not restricted just to private or to public institutions. They can sort of use that across many different areas, and that governor state allocation is allocated for both K through 12 and higher education and other educational opportunities. The second portion, I won't go into this very much because we're focused on higher education, was the K through 12 allocation, which was roughly 44% of this allocation. And then the higher education institution allocation was about 46.3% of the overall allocation. And this money is going directly to higher education institutions like Mizzou, like community colleges. And basically 90% of the money in that pot is being driven purely based on enrollments, and in particular 75% based on full-time equivalent Pell enrollment. So that those are the students that are low income in higher education institutions, and they are students that are on federal financial aid programs already. And then 25% of that allocation is based upon non-Pell enrollment. And so the majority of the funds are going to allocate towards students who are from low income backgrounds who are being subsidized in the first place. An interesting caveat within that is that if a student was already online only in an online program, they were removed from that calculation. And so students that were in purely online programs are not being counted towards this allocation. I think it's quite a large oversight, because I think even students that are in online programs are experiencing crisis with respect to being able to afford education or have the time to do their education. But it was pulled out because this money was sort of meant to be emergency aid towards students that have sort of a sudden large transition. Maybe they had to move home, maybe they had leases they had to cover. And then of that overall allocation, the institutions must use 50% of it to be allocated for emergency aid to students. The other 50% can be used to sort of bolster overall institutional problems. And so you'll see, I'll talk a little bit about Mizzou's program, but 50% of those allocated funds are going directly to students, then 50% can be used to help shore up institutional finance shortages. And then 10% of the overall formula is being specifically targeted towards minority serving institutions, historically Black colleges and universities, Indian education institutions were specifically described within this act to getting a little bit extra money to help sort of stabilize them who sit on a little bit more unstable financial situations. I placed a link in here that sort of goes to the full act, at least the education part of it, to where you can look in sort of the fine details if you would like. How is Mizzou? To give you a little bit of a local context of what's going on. So CARES Act has come. Higher education institutions must apply for those funds, but they're formula driven. Mizzou's response then has created the Student Emergency Fund Program. Mizzou's giving awards ranging from $50 to $1,000. And on their webpage, they specifically say they're trying to sort of use this money and spread it across as most students as possible. They do have a application process to where you can ask for more funds if you have large emergencies, or students whose parents, if they're dependent students, if their parents have sort of been unemployed, there are other means that students can apply for more money than that. But basically, the eligibility is any student who filed the federal application for free application for federal student aid. They're a degree-seeking student. They're not enrolled in an exclusively online program, with the caveat prior to March 13th. So if the program switched, they do count. They're meeting satisfactory academic progress. They're not in loan default, and they're eligible for student aid. And so these are, you don't just have to be a Pell student, a low-income student to qualify, but you must have filed the FAFSA and meet these sort of other minimal sort of requirements to be eligible for financial aid. Students do have to apply for this. It will not automatically be granted to them. They can go online through this website. Here's a website that gives the specific details, but students must apply for this. And so it's not a blanket emergency fund help for them, but they must apply and ask for it and go through that process. And this is, again, sort of, this is coming from 50% of the funds that Mizzou is going to receive would be allocated to student funding. Further within the CARES Act, there's been quite a bit of money that's been pushed into research. So scientific research funding, $75 million has gone to the National Science Foundation, $60 million to NASA, about $100 million to the Department of Energy. A portion of that's for research. A portion of that is to create support, for example, use of supercomputer space and time. Almost $1 billion going to the National Institute of Health, given that that's the primary agency that's going to be funding health-related research. But there's also money going into cultural agencies for research, the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So within the CARES Act, institutions of higher education, researchers can access funds to help fight or understand this sort of pandemic a little bit better, and the federal government sort of allocated this money to these different agencies who then have their own processes and competitions for how they're going to allocate that money for researchers. States have also started to respond, although much more slowly. Some state legislatures are moving legislation related to COVID-19. There's actually only been 3 bills enacted overall across the states as of this time. But broadly, the types of bills that states are moving, one, they're creating policies for refunds and reimbursements. And so they're writing in policy to force institutions of higher education to acknowledge some sort of refund policy, particularly around room and board. So a lot of this is sort of legislature sort of forcing the institutions to give back a portion of the money rather than leaving it up to the institutions themselves to figure that out. Second one is forcing institutions of higher education to have emergency preparedness and management plans. A third and a big one, we're seeing sort of funding and appropriations bills are sort of moving through. In particular, we're seeing some funding policies that are either creating emergency funds for students and institutions and or providing more flexibility in how institutions are going to spend their appropriations money. We're seeing some bills moving around financial aid. Typically, they're either about flexibility in the use of state financial aid for students and institutions, and or New York is moving forward a targeted aid program that would target people that are in essential worker positions to help them fund their college. I think the current bill is about $1,000 to $1,500 to help offset educational costs for educational workers. And then we see some bills moving forward, Massachusetts, in student loan relief, where they're either sort of suspending payments on student loan or sort of helping to offset those costs. The National Conference of State Legislatures has a really great database that you can look on that sort of follows states and the legislation at both K-12 and higher education, and they're following these bills through the process, and you see these different things going on. The states are a little bit farther behind. Most are sort of really working through appropriations at this time. Here in Missouri, there's no direct legislation related to COVID-19 pandemic. Likely due to the timing within our legislative session that when the pandemic really hit, the legislative session was sort of in full swing and most of the bills have been pre-filed and they were moving forward on ones that they thought would actually pass. And then you of course had a delay, a stopping in the legislative session for a little bit. The main one affecting higher education right now is the Higher Education Appropriations Act. That's House Bill 3, which focuses on higher education. The Senate and House at this point have agreed on a bill that was sent, it's not yet sent to the governor, but they have voted on it, approved the sort of consolidated bill. And in fact, in terms of actual appropriations to higher education institutions, they agreed upon to keep appropriations flat from 2019 with a big contingency that there's continued federal funding to help bolster the state's budget. The House had actually passed a 10% cut in appropriations, but in negotiations with the Senate, it was sort of left flat. There's many other things that have sort of been cut on sort of secondary aspects. My guess is some of the other funds that would be going to sort of extension activities and other non-direct appropriations have been cut back a little bit in the appropriations bill, the higher education appropriations bill. But there's still sort of fears that there's going to be potential withholds from the governor or changes to the Appropriations Act by the governor. The governor just came out, I think, yesterday and says we should still expect, more cuts as we sort of move forward. So right now, appropriations looks flat. At least it was passed through the legislature, and the governor always has sort of discretion for sort of within year withholdings and not to sort of fully fund up to that amount if the state budget continues to struggle. In terms of higher education institutional responses to COVID, in the spring, 2 months ago, we saw rapid movement towards online delivery for a majority of higher education institutions. This is some research by some researchers led by Chris Marsicano that sort of shows that what you see is states were declaring state of emergency starting just into early March. And what we have on the vertical axis is the number of institutions, higher education institutions of the sample that they looked at, which was about 1,500 total. This isn't all higher education institutions, but of the sample they looked at, you see a rapid rise from 0 institutions in states of emergency to 1,500 across maybe a 2-week span. Roughly all institutions were in states that had declared states of emergency by about March 15th. Institutions then, within about a week to 10 days after that, were making decisions to fully go online. Not all institutions fully did go online, but 98% of them did make fully online decisions for the spring. And then another week to 10 days, you see that those institutions have actually moved to online delivery. It stair steps, because it's basically they'll start on a Monday, depending on spring break, but you see this sort of rapid change to by about the end of March, all institutions actually were fully online with their delivery. Mizzou would be in the sort of last category as we waited. Actually, we went a little bit earlier the week before spring break, and then moving forward, stay-at-home orders actually came a little bit later. So institutions were moving before the stay-at-home orders, and then you see a slow rise in the number of institutions that had at least one confirmed COVID-19 case, but you're still looking at maybe roughly 25% of institutions, if not less, had sort of confirmed COVID cases. So we had a rapid response over about a month to move from sort of fully in-person classes to fully online classes. However, as institutions are thinking about fall, that has changed quite a bit, and there's a lot more uncertainty playing out. This was as of yesterday. The Chronicle is tracking and updating this every day, what institutions' plan are. About 70% of institutions are still planning for in-person classes. Only about 6 have come out and fully said they're going online. Another 7% hybrid models, and you still see 20 that haven't made decisions whatsoever, sort of declared that. Mizzou would be classified in the planning for in-person classes because that's what we're sort of declaring. But you see quite a bit of different sort of policies coming through. California State University system has stated that most classes will be online. Notre Dame has shifted their academic schedule early, so they're going to start earlier in August and end by Thanksgiving, so students aren't going home for Thanksgiving and then coming back. And again, Mizzou right now, we're planning for fully in-person classes. The emergency curators meeting that's happened yesterday and the day before sort of has come about and basically said the University of Missouri system plans a modest tuition increase. They didn't define what modest was, and a plan for continued budget cuts. And then they've created sort of 3 contingency plans for sort of how do we believe the system is going to be affected if the virus is contained and we're able to sort of fully go through in-person classes in the fall. They're only expecting about a 3% decline in our overall operating budget. If we have to transition at some point in the fall from in-person to online, that's going to jump up from $60 million to about $250 million budget decline as refunds happen. And then if we had to actually make the decision to sort of go fully online, they believe that we'd take about a quarter hit to the overall system budget as we sort of plan out. And so they're sort of planning these 3 cases that are moving forward. This was sort of announced. This is from the Missourian, sort of summarized the curators meeting from yesterday. And sort of just as I think about sort of long-term concerns and where we sort of move forward as higher education institutions, as we think about it, the biggest thing is going to be financial uncertainty. State budgets are very volatile. Tuition budgets are volatile given changing student demand, how students are going to react to online courses, in-person courses, whether they want to travel away to university or not. So there's quite a lot of financial uncertainty that's playing out. The research would say that institutions of higher education are going to sort of shift their focus to other areas of the university to make sure that they can stabilize their budgets. We've seen increased pressure and increased push for grant funding and trying to find other ways that we can shore up the budget. I think a big question that sort of plays into that is sort of how student demand and preferences for online education is going to play out. I think a big question mark is international students. So visas generally require international students to attend in-person classes. It was waived for spring 2020, but there's been no guidance for what's going to happen for fall 2020. If the university decides to go fully online, that could potentially cause issues for visas. And then just in the past couple of days, whether this is sort of just rhetoric or not, there was discussions of sort of reducing or suspending the OPT which is a process for international students as they graduate to stay and work and get work experience post-graduation for a year. And so that of reducing that or even sort of restricting it completely for international students to stay and work post-graduation. And then I think a big concern is around faculty governance versus rapid change, and how do we sort of make these decisions. Last week, Missouri Western University described removing or canceling their history program, but yet increasing things like esports management and sort of these, how are these institutions going to change to sort of meet this nature, and how is faculty governance going to play within that? That's my sort of quick 10-minute sort of presentation to try to sort of move us through. And I look forward to answering questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Brad. If you do have a question, please go ahead and submit in the chat screen, or you can also email me at roacham@missouri.edu. To get started here, we have a question that asks, will we continue to see pauses in policies that restrict modality, like international students taking online courses and limiting thresholds, like the Missouri Coordinating Board of the minutes required of learning for a student credit hour? So pauses of policies.
Yeah, I think this is going to accelerate how we think about the changing modality of higher education. Up until this pandemic, states have really been struggling sort of within the United States about how do we authorize online programs across state borders. So typically, states authorize programs, but what does it mean if Missouri has authorized an online program and students from Arkansas can take that program that hasn't been approved in their own state? And so we've seen quite a bit of discussion and quite a bit of sort of like interactions where most states are entering in agreements to help sort of like maintain minimum expectations for these programs and moving forward. I think with international students, that's a big question that I've been asking in our own programs, because we have international students, and I'm teaching a class in the fall that, and we're being told to sort of be prepared to teach in face or online. And I wanted to know, like, if I made the decision early to go fully online, what would be the implications for our students? And I think at this point, there is no guidance on sort of what does it mean for the international students that are coming here on visas, and whether they can take online courses and meet their sort of visa requirements. And it's difficult because that's typically coming down from federal policy. And I think at this stage, we actually have sort of a restriction of immigration going on, and really sort of thinking about this. That's part of the current policy rhetoric, is talking about getting rid of OPT. So I think international students are going to face a much tougher ability to enroll in our institutions over the next year or two from direct visa policy, but also sort of as institutions are figuring that out. I hope I sort of got to your question a little bit.
Yes. Another question here asks about costs for online courses versus face-to-face courses. Are there differences there?
Good question. The rhetoric around what you're seeing is a lot of people are asking, so nationally, parents and families are asking for refunds, saying why we should get a refund because online education, they believe online education costs less to deliver than face-to-face education, which most of the research has actually shown that that's not necessarily true. Right now, the research would show that if you can do online education at very large scale, you can start to get some cost savings, but you're talking more sort of in the types of programs what we would consider the MOOCs, where it's sort of like the course was created, many people are going through, but there's very low sort of touch. The closer research is actually showing that there's just as much, if not more, faculty labor or labor time going into online education than there is to face-to-face education, because you have faculty engaging with students much more one-on-one throughout a course, rather than sort of getting all the students together for an hour class at a time. And so the economies of scale that are believed, or the cost reduction for online education, simply hasn't been realized. The labor expenses are actually slightly more. If you were able to fully change and get rid of sort of physical capital in plant and sort of buildings and space, there may eventually be able to be some cost savings. But currently right now, online education is the same cost, if not slightly more. And I think that that's sort of being hidden, whereas people think it's cheaper, but the research would show that it's pretty equivalent.
Great, thanks for that. For universities that decide to proceed with on-campus learning in the fall, to what extent will they and can they encourage or require practices such as testing or contact tracing to minimize any sort of disease transmission among students?
My understanding, and I'm not, I don't know exactly the answer to this question, but my understanding is the institutions, if they wished to implement a testing regime, would be able to do so. Institutions of higher education are able to, for freshmen coming on campus, require that they've had certain vaccinations prior to enrollment. And so I think they have the ability to restrict, at this point, restrict students or force them into a testing or even a test and traced regime if they would like to. Of course, with any sort of requirement like that, there's always going to be sort of political concerns that may go on with sort of public education in requiring these. But my understanding is that if the institution wanted to force a testing regime, they would be allowed to. They would just have to sort of think about both the political and the demand ramifications of what that would mean for students and the public, particularly for public institutions.
Great, thank you. Federal policymakers are already working to formulate the next set of COVID-19 related stimulus. So how likely is it that future stimulus bills will include further aid for higher education, and what types of programs might be included in?
That's a good question. My guess, and this is sort of I'm not even sure I'm going to call it an educated guess, but what I've been sort of reading is you would continue to see programs that would help balance institutions' budget, but in particular also a real strong focus to continuing to help provide emergency aid to students. I think you could possibly see sort of increases in the financial aid amounts and then increases to help shore up budgets of institutions as they're sort of transitioning through this. The federal government has actually had a pretty strong focus on minority serving institutions and or continuing their focus on low-income students as the primary target of federal financial aid. I believe that that's where it would continue. But at this point, I'm not sure that I have a really good sort of answer on where I truly believe it would go. Everything I see is sort of, there's just a lot of rhetoric and a lot of different discussions of where it may show up, and it's early in the process.
Sure. I think we have time for one more question. For students, not only did the pandemic change when and how they learned this spring, but it also may have disrupted their summer plans for internships or other on-the-job training. So how can universities support these types of learning experiences, but in a modified format?
I think one way would be to really help and work with students and think about, are there ways that they can complete internship requirements or sort of experiential learning experiences through a socially distanced or an online way? So can they work with the companies and the agencies that are potentially having these internships to find a way for them to do it at a distance so they could engage and work more project-based rather than sort of learning, the nuances of an office would be one way. I know Mizzou, for any student that is completing an internship off campus this summer, they're making, if that student's applying for credit, they're making those institutions or the internship sites agree to work with the students using sort of social distance techniques and to sort of meet the expectations of what the university would like to protect their students the best they can. I think We're seeing study abroad type experiences are sort of really the ones that are going to be the most difficult to sort of replicate and have those students get those sort of experiences. But I think sort of experiential learning, particularly with companies or agencies that are using social distancing appropriately, students are able to sort of work with them and get some internships. And I think it's going to be critical to get students in those experiences as all of these agencies and businesses are changing and are reacting in their own ways. That's a great learning experience for students to sort of see how does change happen? How do we sort of evolve to make those experiences?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Brad, for sharing today's webinar presentation, and thank you to our audience too. When you exit Zoom, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. If you could please consider responding, we'll use the results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future webinar topics. Again, you should receive a recorded copy of today's webinar via email within about a day from now. Our next Engaging for Missouri webinar is scheduled for a week from today, so that's Wednesday, May 27th. Dr. Tracy Griever-Rice, who is the director of the MU Center for Health Policy, and she's also an assistant research professor of rural sociology, will speak about COVID's impacts on the health of rural Missourians. So thanks again for joining us, and I hope you have a nice day. Thanks again, Brad.
Thank you.